This is The Drum Goes Dead by Bess Aldrich. Belfield is similar to 100 other small Midwestern towns. From the air, its buildings look like so many dishes clustered together on a flat table. The covered soup tureen is the community hall. The red vase in the center is the courthouse. The silver-tipped salt shaker is the water tank. There are few changes in the ensemble from year to year. Only the tablecloth is different. There is a vivid green one for a spring, a checkered green and tan one for summer, a mottled yellow, red, and brown one for autumn. Just now, the day before Christmas, Nature, the busy housekeeper, had dressed the table in a snow-white cloth for the first time. It was thin, however, with bare brown places showing through, as though she must patch it soon with more white. In one of the red brick houses, lived the Lannings. There were wreaths in the window of the modest English-type home. A tree stood by the living-room fireplace, and a dressed turkey filled nearly half the refrigerator, just as in 1,000 other comfortable homes that morning. The day was young and breakfast only now underway. "There's just no middle ground," Grace Lanning was saying to her husband. "Either you have a Christmas complex or you don't have one. It's in the blood, I guess, transmitted from one generation to another along with other inheritances like red hair or a hooked nose or a susceptibility to hay fever. And when people have it as you and I do, Rich, and our two families have it before us, and grandparents before that, just loving the old traditions, all I can say is, I pity those who haven't inherited it." Richard Lanning grinned understandingly at his wife's pleasant chatter, as he had done for 20 years. If his usual response was purely mechanical just now, Grace Lanning failed to notice it. They were in the breakfast nook, Richard's bulk somewhat squeezed between the table on the south side of the space-limited kitchen annex. Grace had just set the coffee pot down gingerly, and was squeezing herself between the table and the north side. "Dear me," she frowned during the maneuver. "I wish we had built this nook larger." It was neither a new nor an original statement. One of the four members of the family had used it as a prelude to 7/10 of the breakfasts which had taken place within its narrow confines. One of those other members arrived, now Alice, aged 16, cheerfully ready for high school's last day before vacation, but still unforgiving toward a picayunish school board that had voted to hold classes up to the last minute. Her mother stood to let her pass to the west side of the table, saying, "I wish we'd built this nook." "Well," Alice beamed, "it's really here. The day before Christmas." The 12-year-old member, Eldon, came nosily and hurriedly, casting himself into the remaining chair with table-quivering results, so that his mother said, "Eldon," and automatically, "Dear me, I wish we'd built." "Gee, ain't Christmas great?" the newcomer contributed explosively. "That's the way you feel because you've been brought up like that." His mother was definiteness itself. "Dad and I were just saying so." As a matter of truthfulness, the mechanism of Dad's mouth, throat, and tongue had been engaged entirely with buckwheat cakes, and not conversation. But long married women are like that. My family all went to Grandma Rose as long as she lived. Dad's folks always had the rest of the relatives. She talked on cheerily, reminiscences bubbling from her like the coffee in the percolator. Grace Lanning was healthy, normal, energetic. She enjoyed festivities like tackling a day that involved duties, untangling its loose ends, and tying them in a finished bow knot at its close. One would know that her packages were all tied, cards mailed, meals planned. From where he sat, Richard Lanning could see the poplars blending in the stiff December wind, and the brown brick rear of the Shellhorn home. He gazed at them thoughtfully, his mind engrossed. "Dad, you don't look very Christmassy." Alice had noticed them. No, how could he be so Christmassy this year? How could anyone, for that matter? But he did not say all this. No one but a cad could destroy the family's enthusiasm. So he turned her observation off with banter. Breakfast finished. There was the usual commotion when the children and the father left, even an extra amount due to countless directions about the packages and errands. Then Richard Lanning was walking alone down the street to the Belfield State Bank, where he had been cashier for so many years. Stories are seldom written about the Richard Lannings. Stage plays do not revolve around them. The screen consistently ignores them. To work steadily and honestly at one business, to love one woman and no other, to be neither the target for criticism because of wealth, nor the object of sympathy because of poverty, does not make for colorful drama. But there are so many small-town Richard Lannings. No, there was nothing dramatic about the cashier of the Belfield Bank walking to business every morning of his life, returning every evening to Grace and 2 children, accepting as he saw in those intervening hours all the joys and sorrows, pleasures and worries of the community passed in front of that grilled. It was of these people he was thinking as he walked the 5 blocks this gray morning, scorning the car for so short a distance. "That's why old Professor Shellhorn is still so spry," he was wont to say. "He's never stopped walking and so never lost the use of his legs." It was cold and windy, and even though the air felt damp, there had been very little snow. Nature had been parsimonious with her good moisture these last few years. By that withholding, she had ruined 3 corn crops, lessened pasturage, killed many of the town's fine old trees, and created havoc in the community. Richard picked his way along the snowy walk. On every block were houses and garages that needed painting, the trunks of dead trees that should be cut. The general rundown and appearance of the little town lay heavily on his mind. The depression, the one with the capital D, had never quite left the community. Just as they had been pulling out of it, the drought had settled down over the land like a smothering blanket. "But our county always has good corn," everyone had said at first. "Sometimes, farther out west, there's drought, but never here." And yet this was the 3rd bad year for the corn, which had come up each season with so much promise. Even the wheat harvested earlier this year had been varied, good in sections, but streaked with rust on some of the best farms. This past early summer, soaking rains had come, and the corn had stood green and tall in the fields. Then in a single day, a hot wind had blown out of the south, like the blast from some satanic smithy's forge, and undone all the work of the springtime. The intense heat fairly boiled the water at the corn's roots, steaming it up into the tender stalks and virtually cooking them, even brewing a poison in them, so that the farmers who turned their cattle into the brown fields had lost some and saved others by only a desperate fight. It was as though Providence would not help these men in lifting of their burdens. They had worked so hard, so faithfully, their hope always renewed at the spring planting, and nature would not do her share. Only a few years before there had been ample rains, fine corn, fat cattle on the rolling hills, the big barns and silos filled with feed. Now for 3 years there were half crops, poor pastures, thin animals peeling paint on the barns. As in all agricultural sections, the farmers' plight was the townspeople's worry also. So closely were their business intertwined, and this was the day to say Merry Christmas across the bank's counter to these people who were not merry, whose every waking hour was filled with financial worry. Not only was this community troubled, but the whole world was in turmoil. Nations were at other nations' throats, but no one must forget to sing a mawkish, peace on earth. There were countless dissensions in our own country, quarrels over parties and creeds and divergent lines of thought, but every participant must stop his squabbling long enough to mouth a hypocritical goodwill to men. That night at the community hall, the children would sing, "All is calm, all is bright." There would be a silver star at the top of a tree, symbol of good cheer and tranquility, and there was neither cheer nor tranquility here or anywhere else. Well, he himself would not be a part of it. For nearly a dozen years he had been Santa Claus at the program. Just why, he had never stopped to question. Merely one of those ruts into which a small-town man slips. But no more. Charlie Pearson had promised to go through this farce tonight. For the whole thing was a travesty under these conditions. It would be more honest to abandon the celebration of the day temporarily, face the facts, decide that until things were somewhat righted, there would be no tree, no star, no gifts, no carols. When misery had worried and abated, when the human mind was ready to receive the thoughts of these symbols again, the heat respond to the harmony for which they stood, then renew the traditional services. It was dishonorable to pretend, hypocritical to mouth these prayers and sing of peace. With honest self-analysis, Richard Lanning knew this was a frightening change in his way of thinking. He could scarcely believe that he was the same person who, as a boy, had so loved the season. Grace had referred to his family at breakfast time. He had a sudden vision now of the farmhouse, the snow banked high against its own stone walls, but within them a hospitality, as warm as the fires from the great wood stoves. The wreaths had been made from the pines in the yard, and the gifts had been simple. There had been a tree and a star and Christmas carols round the old piano. There had been a better feeling then, and people had seemed kinder. They had their disappointments with better spirit, pulled themselves through their difficulties with more independence and courage. As a boy in that environment, he had fairly worshipped the Christmas time. As a young married man, he had not lost his pleasure in it. When his children came, he had thrilled to a renewal of it through them. Even now, he had no intention of pricking the bubble of their enthusiasm. Let them enjoy themselves while they could. Only a few short seasons ago, he too had felt with them the spirit of the day. He would put on a good front now, but he wanted more than that. He wished deeply that he could feel a measure of their fervor as once he had done. But the capacity to do so seemed gone. Something of that spirit was dead, with him, and the death of the spirit is a grievous thing. He was at the bank now. 2 of the little staff of the 5 arrived as he did. George Adams, the wise-cracking son of the president, facetiously greeting the no longer young Elsie Rouse with, "'Twas the night before Christmas and all through the house. Not a creature was stirring, not even Miss Rouse." Elsie put a wreath of holly in each service window, with George making flippant remarks about changing it to mistletoe if the new teacher came in. Richard Lanning opened the vault. The others arrived. The voice of the president issued from an inner office. The 9 o'clock mail was opened. Everyone was busy. Town people began straggling in, a farmer or two, a small trickle that would change later in the day to a stream. There was a deposit made, some interest paid, cream checks cashed. Your country bank cashier had no specific duties, no department over which he presides exclusively as does his city contemporary. He receives money and pays it out, makes loans and adroitly refuses them, takes his turn at the books, clerks at many a farm sale, advises his customers when to buy hogs, to marry, and to have their tonsils out. So if Richard Lanning put aside the pessimistic thoughts which had enwrapped his mind like a dark cloak, it was only because some of these various tasks blotted them out. Even so, he was vaguely conscious of the cast-off garment which he must wear again, sensed that back of the meticulous handling of his work there was a longing for more shining armor. Although there were fussy customers who would have tried the soul of Job, to all who stood in front of his window he was courteous, without regard to age, financial standing, or previous condition of servitude. It was one of his assets, so he spoke pleasantly of the holiday to everyone. "How does it seem to be home for Christmas? Going to your daughter's as usual?" It was mid-forenoon when Miss Jarman came in. She had been a teacher, but home for many years now caring for her father, the county's last Grand Army man. Richard Lanning could remember how Marshal Jarman had always rode a horse at the head of the memorial procession, holding in the prancing speed with taut rein, as he surreptitiously spurred it into more cavorting. "Merry Christmas, Miss Jarman." "Yes, say it even though the pension is all they have. How's your father?" "Father's out in the car." "I'll step out to see him. George, you take care of Miss Jarman's wants." This was part of the ritual when the old man favored the bank with his presence at the curb. He had been a leading property holder in a long-gone day, but the only deed in his tin box now was the one to the little GAR hole, which he had grimly refused to turn over to the upstart veterans of the 2 later wars. He found the old man in the overcoat, cap, muffler, and mittens, a blanket around his knees. His mind was clear, his body a sapless leaf quivering before the coming winds in the trees. He was pleased at the attention given him, shook Richard's hands through the car window. "Merry Christmas," his old voice croaked. "Merry Christmas," Richard responded, but not so very merry, with bad crops, everybody feeling hard up and the world in a mess. "You know," the old man quavered, "I've been thinking about all the Christmases I've seen. If I live tonight, this will be my 94th. He chortled as though the joke would be on someone if he made it through the night. "Been trying to remember as many as I could." His voice had no vibrancy, but his mind clung tenaciously to its line of thought. "Sometimes I know the years, sometimes not, but you'd be surprised how many I can recollect. Dozens of them." You had to humor him. "Which was your best one?" Immediately, Richard Lanning was wondering why he had asked him. It would only start him off the flood of "I recollects." Yes, there it came. "Well, now, when I was 7, that must have been 1854. Mother was trying to hold our bodies and soul together, promising us a good Christmas, and yet not knowing where it was coming from. What do you think happened? My pappy came home from the far west. One of the 49ers he was. Tramping in after dark that way, us young'uns got him all mixed up with old Sandy Claus. Yes, sir. The bleary old eyes peered at Richard. Can recollect most every Christmas, including the one when we had that big bonfire at Atlanty, Georgie, before starting out with Sherman on that little hoof and jaunt we took out to the sea. But the one I recollect as the best of all was the one when I took my bride to our first home. It was a soddy, only one room, but snug as could be, and we thought it was about as the nicest home anybody could have. Our first Christmas there, he would have gone on endlessly if his daughter had not arrived. Back at work, with something of the old man's rambling talk still in his mind, Richard Lanning found himself asking the next customer, "What was the best Christmas you ever had?" It was Hulda Bornemeyer, who had worked for them when Alice was born. She was a farmer's wife now, and today was cashing her cream check. Her fat red face lighted. "Oh, there's lots of good ones, Mr. Lanning. Maybe the best was when I was a slip of a girl and hiring out already yet to be a family up beyond Mapleton. They wasn't much on Christmas. Kinda laughed at doing anything extra. And my folks was so much for it. Always a little tree, Tannenbaum we called it, and candles on it, and pepper nuts, and singing Stille Nacht, Heile Nacht, and drinking a toast in the Kummel. I was going home, but there had come a big snow and I had to give up the thought. The Pa came for me through it, shoveling the drifts, and when we got there, finally, I opened the kitchen door and smelled the fresh coffee cake and Christmas cookies, saw the little green tree on the table and knew I was home. I guess that one couldn't be beat. A trucker brought in a shipment of supplies and stopped for his pay. "Well, Jake, how goes it?" "Not so good. The missus had to have an operation." "That's tough. Christmas doesn't seem like it used to." "No, it don't that." "Just for fun, Jake, tell me what Christmas you remember best." Jake took off his cap and ran his hand through the ring of graying hair which circled his head like a fuzzy halo. "Don't laugh, but you asked for it. When I was a scrubby kid, my mother used to get us all around her and read us the Bible story on Christmas Eve. Once, when I'd gone to bed and was asleep, some young folks who took a notion to go around singing woke me up with that there, 'Hark the Herald Angels Sing.' From where I lay, I could see a big star looking in at me, and kid-like, I thought the music was coming from the sky like in the story, and I was plumb scared." He shifted tired feet and leaned heavily on the shelf of the grilled window. "But that ain't all. In '98, we'd just got to Camp Columbia near Mariano, Cuba, the day before Christmas. Had breakfast aboard a ship while it was still dark, and one of our company had fell through a hatchway and was killed. Made us blue as indigo. Day was sticky hot. Christmas rations was going to be poor, canned salmon, potatoes, and coffee, all that junk we had then. None of this stylish board the Army has now for us Spanish-American volunteers. Everybody was homesick. Went to bed in the middle of the night and was woke from a sound sleep by the same 'Hark the Herald Angels Sing.' Some of the band boys was playing and some singing it. Waking up that way out of a sound sleep, hearing that Christmas song, I'll be darned if that wasn't the biggest star you ever saw hanging low in the sky and shining through the tent. It took me a long time to come and find out I wasn't that same scared little kid at home hearing music out of the sky. I ain't ashamed to say I shed a tear or two in that old Army blanket. I was that homesick." He began asking others, "What's that Christmas you remember best, J.B.?" The man was a merchant, hard-working, taciturn. He put the deposit receipt in his billfold, squinted into it as though the answer were there in its dingy interior. "I guess the time I was in Alaska, Dick, when I was a young fellow. Was up at the little town of Candle then, up above the circle. All the residenters decided to give a little Christmas dinner to the boys up the creek, and any of the rest of the world that might happen along. Table was decorated with green and candles lighted, had baked fish and ptarmigan stew. 80 white folks at 25 Eskimos. A pretty decent orderly crowd, I'll say. Those miners dressed in parkas and mucklucks. Not half the rowdy goings-on you expect. Guess the singing Christmas songs round the table sorta got them thinking of home. All day they came and went, these common, ordinary, small-town folk. And all day, if the circumstances allowed, Richard Lanning asked his question. To a young girl who had taken a maid's place in a nearby city instead of a university course when her hope of schooling vanished with the drying corn. "Which was the best Christmas you ever had, Marion?" "Oh, Mr. Lanning, this one. To get home for the first time. To a little old lady with an income of $8 a month. What's your best Christmas, Grandma?" "Oh, my. Just any of them, I guess. when the children were at home. By the middle of the afternoon, there was no time for social conversation. The cashier was a machine, working almost as mechanically as the one clicking near him under the hand of Elsie Rouse. All we need now to add to the old home week are the examiners or old scholastic shell-horn, young Adams took time to say. So soon afterward, they were obligated to avoid each other's eyes for fear of laughing. Old Professor Shellhorn came in, his cane thumping across the little lobby, with George muttering under his breath, "And what is the subject of our lecture today, Professor?" "Merry Christmas," the old man nodded gravely to them all. "Christmas time again, good friends." He spread out his arms in theatrical gesture, quoted grandiloquently, "Now good cheer and welcome. Not a cup of drink must pass without a carol. The beast, the fowl, the fish come to a general execution, and the corn is ground to dust for the bakehouse and the pastry. You see, I have been reading again, as I have for many years, the Christmas customs of old England. Those were merry days, according to authentic information. The pedantic old man. It was several centuries ago that was written anent the Christmas season. The maskers and the mummers make the merry sport, but if they lose their money, their drum goes dead. I have been telling my daughter-in-law that while the original thought was not quite the same as my modern application, it had held good for these hundreds of years. We are all more or less like that, are we not? We're maskers and mummers having a merry time, but if we lose our money or our crops or a friend, this drum goes dead. It takes a great deal of spirit and courage to beat away, though nothing had happened, does it not?" He cashed his small check and left, thumping his cane along the lobby floor. It was closing time. The shutters were drawn, the big doors locked, but there were 2 hours yet of work behind the scenes. A few feathery snowflakes fluttered into the gathering winter dusk as Richard Lanning walked home, tired from the busy day. His own worries and the burdens of the people still with him. It was true. The drum goes dead. The lights of the small town stores shone across the walk. Others twinkled up and down the familiar old streets. He had glimpses of the Christmas trees in all the houses, the brick ones in the frame, the well-kept ones and the shabby ones with peeling paint. All the homes of the community seemed striving for traditional cheer and goodwill. It brought to mind the experiences the customers had told him, and suddenly the thought struck him that through everything they had said ran the theme of home. When the children were all home, thought I was a kid again at home. Took my bride to my home. Christmas, by magical invisible cords, bound everyone to his home. They were almost interchangeable, those words, Christmas and home. Here he was at his own, brightly lighted, with wreaths in the window and the little trees sparkling. Alice met him at the door. "Dad, you've got to be Santa Claus yourself again. Charlie Pearson just phoned. He broke a bone in his wrist this afternoon. He got it in a splint or sling or something. He said every little kid would know who he was with his arm that way. Besides, whoever saw a Santa Claus with a busted arm?" Thinking of how incongruous was the combination of his low spirits and the mask of the merry patron saint gave him the first hearty laugh of the day. Oh, well, what was it old Shellhorn had said about the maskers and the mummers? Dinner was pushed along a bit hastily on account of the program. Eldon was feverishly excited, frankly anticipating a rifle in the morning, reminding all and sundry that if he was getting one, not to forget the shot. Alice was equally anticipatory, but putting up what she fondly thought was a more sophisticated front. Grace called the roll of the baskets she had taken here and there, the little packages she had delivered, the various tasks performed. All the loose ends of the day were tied, and she was vocally percolating about them. Community Hall, the covered soup tureen of a building, was gaily lighted, decorated, and surcharged with the electricity of youthful spirits. Santa Claus, secreted in the wings until such time as he would walk out to the tree, could smell the resinous odor of the pines, could see through an aperture in the upturned faces of the children of the community at the front of the room, their elders behind them. All the people who had known losses and hard times were out there. Old Professor Shellhorn, who had lost his money. Huldah, whose best team had died. Jake, whose missus had to have the operation. Old Grandma Smith, whose children had gone away. From the wings he could see them all, their careworn faces relaxed, their eyes on the performing children. It was the typical yearly program, small, townish, and laughable unless one knows and understands the little crossroads of the country. Mrs. Henry Neiman, rendering her annual solo, bursting forth from the wings like a palpitating Brunhild, Fat Amy Anderson reciting an adenoidal piece which sounded like "Forever at a day, till the wash'll crumble to ruin and boulder and dust away." Red-headed Joey Myers doing a staccato machine gun version of "On Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen." A group of tiny Christmas elves arriving on the stage to sing "Here We Come Tripping," and true enough, in gazing up to the awesome distances of the rafters above them, losing their balance and going down like dominoes. Then the tableau of the manger scene, with a youthful Joseph swathed in Turkish towels, standing first on one foot and then the other, grinning sheepishly at the audience, with a husky 2-year-old babe peeping up over the side of the mangers and being pushed back determinedly by the supposedly gentle Mary. Then a song dying away gave the cure for Santa Claus to proceed with the important work of the evening, the calling of names for the packages under the tree. There was no great mystery over the impersonation. Almost anyone in the audience, except the tiniest children, awestruck and believing, could have told that Richard Lanning was the patron saint. So that when he picked up a flat package to read his own name, saying with great gusto, "I'll see that Mr. Lanning gets this later," and slipped it into one of the red pockets, a boy called back, "Open it yourself now." "Yeah, open it yourself, Santy Lanning," another said, with the whole audience laughing. It was a queer Christmas gift, a mere booklet of drawing paper with a school-made design on its cover. Inside, it said that grades in high school by unanimous vote had chosen Mr. Richard Lanning as Belfield's most helpful citizen, counselor, and friend. This was to tell him so, and to wish him a very Merry Christmas, and many more, signed by classes with all the children's names. Santa Claus, grateful for his merry mask which covered no little surprise and a bit of emotion, thanked the boys and girls on behalf of Richard Lanning, who, he was sure, would always try to merit their respect. And now the whole school was singing the last song. "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by." The high sweet voices rose, tremulous with childish fervor. "Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." The man who had been feeling that Christmas gifts should be abandoned until the world could give and receive them with better heart was looking into the glowing faces of children who had just made him a gift of cheap drawing paper, a priceless gift of heartwarming friendship and trust, and so suddenly that it seemed a new thought, though it was as old as the silent stars. A bright-colored strand wove itself across the gray warp of his mind. The world was not in chaos to these children. Through their eyes, it was still the same world of limited dimensions he and these other burdened people had known as children, and because this was so, it was still a good world. Humanity must hang fast to its faith and its hope. It must never let them go as long as there remained in the world a child and a song, a gift and a star. Peculiarly, he had a sensation of lightening spirits. Nothing had changed materially. The same losses, disappointments, and burdens awaited the community outside like dark-omened birds of prey, but they seemed less forbidding now. He felt mentally strengthened, emotionally comforted. He could carry on as a helpful citizen, counselor, and friend. Everyone went home, to the big houses and the little ones, the well-kept ones and those with peeling paint. The homes which, God be thanked, were still a part of the bulwark of the nation. The snow was covering the unfruitful corn lands, and the green winter wheat with its life-giving moisture, reminding all that another spring would come. The Christmas stars hung low in the winter sky. Up the streets, the high, clear voices of carolers were singing, "Noel, Noel." Santa Claus, whose musical voice was not the type one would call of concert quality, suddenly broke forth into a lusty, off-key version of "Drums in My Heart," so that Grace said, "For goodness sake, Rich, being Santa and getting the school children's praise must have upset you. Not touched in the head, are you?" "No," he grinned, just beginning to feel young and hopeful and a bit Christmassy. Thank you for listening to The Drum Goes Dead by Bess Aldrich. To learn more about Mrs. Aldrich, visit beststreeteraldrich.org.